Please won't you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts together find their way into the heart of God this morning. Amen. So this Advent season, we are talking about flinging open the doors, opening them ever wider to the people we have closed out in the past. And during this pandemic period, ironically, we had to close the doors. We had to limit the guest list once we opened them back up. We purposely excluded people in the name of safety, and regardless of how well-intentioned and life-saving, it has undoubtedly harmed us. We made our lives smaller and our tables smaller, making room for only our households or for our carefully chosen pandemic pods. Some of us locking down, whittling down, and even eventually losing touch with those that we once interacted with, from our church friends to the grocery store clerks to even our dearest friends and even our family. Our perceived enemies grew far more menacing during this time as well. Once given the tools to re-enter the world, some of you report to me that you no longer want to, not only out of fear of possibly contracting COVID, but out of fear of each other. I have been meeting with different groups in this church, and asking what we need to heal after this long period of exile and spiritual homelessness. And the answers I most often get have nothing to do with COVID-19 and everything to do with the escalation and outrage and contempt and the political and ideological rhetoric that we so often see only on the internet, which is the only way that we've been interacting with most people these days. It's been dividing our neighbors and our friends and even our family. The media that we consume has shrunk the guest list at our tables as much, if not more, than COVID-19 has. It has become our sacred text, the media that we consume, the media that consumes us. It has been aiding and abetting us at failing to live up to our name, the peace that comes from justice, as Baruch says, the honor that comes from reverence for God. Our contempt for each other and the words we say so callously to describe our perceived enemies has deadly consequences. We found that out once again this week. Occasionally, a disturbed soul goes beyond warring with his fingers behind a screen and picks from an arsenal of deadly tools of rage, like what happened in the Waukesha, Wisconsin Christmas parade attack, or at an Oxford, Michigan high school this week. Nadia Bolz-Weber writes, "With his still wounded hands, Christ our King is gently taking the gun out of ours and saying, 'It's okay, you won't be needing this.'" We are called by the prophets to ask ourselves, do we want revenge or justice? Do we want contempt or mercy? Do we want war or peace? How we answer those questions is the key to our salvation. Next time we hear ourselves naming whole groups of people as fascist or terrorist or evil or communist or demonic, we need to turn off our absolutely ridiculous cable news networks and open our Bibles. We need to turn off our carefully curated social media propaganda machines and sit down at the table together. I promise you that your cable news network does not love you, but God does. I promise you that Mark Zuckerberg does not have your best interests at heart. Amen?
Amen.
But God does. On Thursday night, 12 of us gathered for pub theology at the Mill in West Boylston to talk about belonging. There were people there who were brand new to us and people who were wanting to reconnect after a period of absence. And we talked about times when we felt like we didn't belong and times we made other people feel like they didn't belong. We think that this feeling of not belonging causes violence, causes contempt. So one participant that I hadn't seen in over 2 years admitted that he almost didn't come that night because he had been absent for so long from the church. He didn't know if there would still be a place for him at the table. Some told stories about friends who had rejected them. Others told stories about churches that told them that they didn't belong at the table because of their sexuality or neurodivergent ways of being human. Perhaps the more vulnerable stories were told about times that we excluded other people, though. We told stories about the limits of our welcome and about times that we have excluded people from the table because of addiction or mental health issues that made it hard to be fully inclusive, or about times we have judged people based on what they looked like or what they believed. So we talked about what it might look like to pull up more chairs to our church's table and make room for God. So look around this room, I mean it. Never do what I say when I tell you to do this. I'm never being metaphorical. Who are we missing? Who have we not made room for? If a stranger is a part of the family of God and a piece of us that we do not yet know, we are missing a whole lot of God's glory up in this house. Amen? We are missing a whole lot of God's glory up in this house. So this Advent, we are preparing for the arrival of a baby boy who will usher in a new reign of peace. Our God appears to us small and unexpected, a tiny child who will save the broken, angry, despairing world that we inhabit. This Advent, we prepare him room. So for those of you who don't know what this is like, after finding out that we are pregnant, new parents often move from joy to immediate anxiety, right? About all kinds of things. How am I going to afford this? Is my house big enough? But mostly about the world that we are bringing the baby into, right? Since we can't fix up the world, we fix up our homes. I think this practice may contain a lot of wisdom for us right now. My friend Kristen Turner, who's sitting right there, always says, you look surprised. She always says that if the world feels too big to change, get to changing your own world, right? Something like that. When we are preparing for the arrival of a baby near the end of pregnancy, near the end, right? We mothers are biologically programmed to what? Nest. Exactly. So we clear out the guest room, we paint it, we fill it with Pinterest-inspired nursery decor from our registry that the baby won't even notice. And I remember scrubbing out the grout in the shower at like 39 weeks pregnant, thinking for sure the newborn baby wouldn't want to see dirty grout, right? I couldn't even reach my feet, but suddenly, sweeping all the baseboards so the baby wouldn't be embarrassed of our apartment seemed necessary. And now that we've cleared out and made space, our next task is to name the baby. When people are called by their name, they feel a sense of belonging, the sense of being known. We cannot fully and humbly embrace a visitor without knowing their names and without them knowing ours, right? This is why it is so important that we wear our name tags when we walk through those doors. When we are called by our names from the mouths of strangers, we are no longer strangers. It is disarming and tender to be called by name. I think if people wore name tags everywhere we went, everywhere in the world, from the grocery store to the mall, the world would be a kinder, more beautiful place. Amen? Names matter because every life is particular and real. The day that my son was born, one of my friends said, Isaac Bartlett Linscott, that's a name for a poet or a composer of great works of classical music. Or a man who wears a leather jacket. That name is a lot to live up to, she said. What we are called by God is far more important to who we are and who we will become than what our parents name us, though. I call all of you beloved because it's the name that God gave you from before you were born. And that name is a lot to live up to, right? The prophet Baruch says, God will give you this name by which to be called forever. The peace that comes from justice, the honor that comes from reverence for God. That is the name Baruch says God gives God's people. The peace that comes from justice. That name is a whole lot to live up to. The book of Baruch you may not have heard of because it is an apocryphal book, which means that it is not in our pew Bibles. It is in Catholic Bibles and what's called the Deuterocanonical text. That's a really big way of saying the texts that matter less. It's not in the official Protestant canon at all. And I'm so glad that it was included in the Advent lectionary this week because it is gorgeous. Baruch was a scholar of the prophet Jeremiah, and he's a poet. And this text would have been well known in Jesus' time, this text that we read. Baruch is often quoted in the New Testament, and the New Testament writers knew this material very, very well. And Baruch writes this extended poetry reflecting on the experience of being in exile. The exilic period for the refugee Israelites was a protracted time of homelessness. And so Baruch asks, how can God live inside of us when we no longer have a home? When you are homeless, clothing is an essential gift from God, since in many cases your clothes are your only shelter, right? So when Baruch says, take off your mourning clothes, throw off your oppression, and clothe yourselves in the dignity of God's glory instead, this is significant. Your very home, he says, is in God's glory. That is the home that we live in. It's the home that we welcome other people into. And we, too, have been through a long period of exile and spiritual homelessness during this pandemic. And Baruch tells us that the only response is to throw off your mourning clothes, to dress yourselves in dignity, and open your hearts in welcome. He calls us by this name, the peace that comes from justice. He brands us with the honor that comes from reverence for God. And that may be a lot to live up to right now, but Jesus tells us how. He says, for I was hungry, and you, what? Gave me something to eat. You fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in to your home. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. And the righteous ask him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? They didn't remember doing this. When did we see you sick and in prison and go to visit you? And he says, what? Whatever you do for the least of these, brothers and sisters of mine, you do for me. That tiny, helpless baby, king of the least of these, is going to be hungry when he arrives. So now that we've cleaned out a space, washed the grout, nested, and named him, we better prepare to feed him. We prepare a place at the table. We even prepare them for our newborns, even though they can't sit there yet. Because we truly become family when we eat together. Isn't that right? When we are welcoming someone into our home and in our hearts, we know that food will be served. God asks that we expand our guest list for all of whom God names and remembers, from the east to the west, as Baruch says. So we expand the guest list to include the widow and the orphan and the baby and the homeless refugee. For everyone born, a place at the table. If your table is not big enough, check your heart and let your love grow richer so you can remember what really matters, as St. Paul reminds us in his letter to the Philippians. Then build a bigger one. Make room. The practices that come directly from our love growing richer, compassion, empathy, welcome, dignity, peace, are the practices that will serve us, help us to live up to our name. Each person that you encounter, beloved, is a chance to know Jesus. So clear out your shame, your judgment, your scarcity mindset, your fear, your contempt. Learn the names of the people you encounter, remembering you are both named beloved by the one who created you ultimately. Make a place at your tables. When we welcome the stranger, we define ourselves not by the names of our warring tribes, but by our capacity for mercy, justice, and peace. If we have any hope of living up to God's name for us, we need to cast off our mourning clothes, clothe ourselves in dignity, open our doors wide, and set a place for love at that table. Amen.